Welcome to the Screen the Screener College Basketball Podcast with your hosts, Mike Randle and Gus Kearns.
Welcome back to the Screen the Screener College Basketball Podcast, where we continue on our way previewing each and every college basketball team, all 357 teams in the college basketball landscape. I'm your host, Mike Randle. Please follow me at Twitter at RandleRand. Today we have an old favorite coming back on to talk about one of the best programs in the country, Jesse Newell, who covers KU basketball for the Kansas City Star. He joins us here to talk about the Kansas Jayhawks, of course, one of the premier programs and where you really need to start when you talk about college basketball each and every year. Follow him on Twitter at Jesse Newell. Jesse, great to have you back on the pod. How we doing?
Doing good. Yeah. Another season for KU basketball where the expectations are high. So, it's another day where the sun rose in the east.
Yeah, they are certainly high. And I remember, my friend, we've been talking about, Snoop Dogg in the past. And we talked about, big parties at the Fog and the preseason and stuff like that. But I want to start, of course, with COVID, where I'm going with everyone. And we look back on Kansas last year. How did COVID affect them? Quarantines, things like that. They battled their way through a real solid season, of course, not to the level that they want. But there were so many obstacles last year and so many things that threw everyone off. Talk about how the Jayhawks dealt with it in 2021.
Yeah, it was a strange season for COVID for Kansas because, sort of knock on wood for them, almost the entire season they had avoided it. And I know Bill Self was pretty pleased. They played Baylor in February, and Baylor had just recovered from their COVID outbreak and really didn't look like themselves. But Kansas, for almost the entire season, had just missed it. They had all their guys available and really gotten fortunate, played all but one of their games, and then they were able to make it up on the back end. So it was crazy how good and how fortunate they had been. And Bill Self kind of mentioned throughout the season, people ask him, how did this happen? How were you able to do this? And he would say, well, some of it is the guys and some of it's good luck. And then the NCAA tournament came, and you saw how much of that luck played into it, because then KU had all sorts of COVID problems. They had Tristan and Aruna out, Jalen Wilson was out, David McCormick was out for a period of time, and they actually had to back out of the Big 12 tournament because of the positives that they had on their team in that particular time. So for Kansas, it really was sort of unfortunate for them, because as they saw other teams deal with their issues in December or January or February, KU's really popped up at the most inopportune time in March Madness. And listen, it's not what led to the 34-point loss to USC. USC played amazing. Kansas obviously did not play well in its 40 minutes on that day, but obviously it didn't help. It did not help that Kansas was dealing with all sorts of quarantine, getting guys back, getting them back just the day before they were playing the biggest game of the season. So it was a fascinating year for Kansas in terms of COVID, just because for most of the year they went by scot-free, and then when the games mattered most, they really got hit pretty hard.
Yeah, and the end of the year, of course, that's got to be frustrating, because they play Oklahoma, who beat Iowa State. They beat Oklahoma 69-62. And then they're battling with Texas. Really a game that everyone wanted to see here. Texas versus Kansas, playing into the finals. And they just had to forfeit it, basically. And Texas was able to advance, which obviously I think, Jesse, threw everyone off going into the NCAA tournament. They battled a gamey Eastern Washington team. But what was the feeling after not being able to finish off the Big 12? Was there some sort of apprehension? Because I feel like that 9-day layoff, then they go Eastern Washington. They come right back against USC, dominant big men inside, Mobley, of course. I just think that's a little tough for any program.
Well, yeah, and again, I mean, this is college basketball. Anything can happen in 40 minutes. And this was not a game where you're looking at it and saying, hey, Kansas is a 10-point underdog, 20-point underdog. I think it was somewhere around USC by 2 or 3, which, again, this is not what most people expected. I think, with the seedings of those, KU was obviously the better seeded team in that, but USC was sort of, if you look at the advanced metrics, the Ken Palms of the world loved them more than maybe the AP poll measures, those sorts of things. So, and maybe a team that had flown a little bit under the radar on the West Coast and had lost some of the games you wouldn't expect them to, and maybe dropped the ranking a little bit, but it was just difficult for Kansas. They're trying to bring guys back in. I remember there was, flights that they were taking, private flights they were taking to get people from Lawrence to Indianapolis to make sure that they could make them for the, make the NCAA tournament game so they could be as full strength as possible. And again, that very final result, it was not the Kansas team that you're used to seeing, just because, guys like Jalen Wilson were not themselves. David McCormick, he was actually battling through a foot injury as well. So that was not good for them. And then some of their depth, Tristan and Aruna, he was having to sit out, all those sorts of things. So it was unfortunate for them. As you said, what's tricky is, and this sort of ruins the narrative, I think. Everybody remembers the last game. I mean, that's human nature, especially in college basketball. Everybody remembers the last game. Before that last game, KU had played pretty well in February. You know, I just talked about them. They beat Baylor at home, which was the first team to beat Baylor. And Baylor was not up to snuff at that moment when it came to COVID, but still nobody had beaten Baylor before that. So It was obviously a good win there. And KU actually was sort of trending in the right direction towards the end of the season for the most part. And then all this sort of stuff hit and kind of sidetracked what was going on. So unfortunate that, you know, when one game gets away from you, and obviously when you lose by 34 points in the NCAA tournament, one of the worst losses in the NCAA tournament in Kansas basketball history, that's what is going to be remembered in the season. And it's crazy because it sort of sent KU, the coaching staff, Bill Self, on a divergent path this offseason, I think all because of that blowout loss. I mean, if KU would have beat USC, you know, maybe gotten to a Sweet 16 or Elite 8 and everybody wouldn't have felt kind of the letdown of the season, I'm not sure that this postseason or this summer would have turned out the way it did for Kansas. But obviously Bill Self was ready to retool his roster, and retool his roster is exactly what he did.
Yes, and that's a really great point. That Baylor game, we're in New Jersey, so our view is basically Kansas is going to get it going. Kansas is always a tough out. And that was a big win. They held Jared Butler to 5 points in that game. He had foul trouble. And they really did this, Jesse, without a true point guard the entire year. They went back and forth and tried to mix and match, but it wasn't a traditional team where they had that strong point and center inside, you work in that combination. So let's talk about the players that are not coming back, headlined by, of course, Marcus Garrett, who finished off. He's doing very well from what I'm hearing right now, competing well out in the Summer League.
Yeah, and he's he's a difficult player to really pin down because, you know, you talk to Bill Self and he'll talk about how maybe the best defensive player that he's had in all his years at Kansas, and he was a Bill Self favorite, and he has all the tools. Again, he's shown that in the Summer League. He has long arms, he gets skinny on screens, he's just a pest defensively. His problem really for Kansas was the lack of a position on the offensive end. You know, he's not really a shooter, so you can't put him on the wing. He's not an amazing passer, and he could get to a right-handed finish layup, but just throughout the course of the season when he played a bunch of minutes, he just seemed to lose his explosiveness, his athleticism, especially when KU was playing him a lot of minutes. And so Bill Self started to back off of him on that. So maybe in the NBA, that could be a better role for him, is that if you play him spot minutes, if you play him 10 to 12 minutes and he's a role reserve guy for you, he can be out there and be super energetic. It was very difficult to work with Kansas. And that's, I mean, I don't want to pin it all on one player, but it's a big reason that Kansas struggled so much offensively last year. If you look at their numbers from the advanced stats, it's the worst offense that Bill Self has had in his 18 seasons at Kansas. And you mentioned the point guard play. I mean, if you think back to Kansas and point guards, you envision guys that can create their own shot, get to the rim, and make threes. You know, you think about Frank Mason, Devontae Graham, Sharon Collins, Tyshawn Taylor, and it was just that sort of wiggle, that sort of creatability that Bill Self has had in the past. They just did not have it last year. So I'm not here to tell you that KU is going to be better off without Marcus Garrett. Marcus Garrett's a great player in his own right. And like you said, he's showing a lot of his skills at the NBA Summer League level. I'm here to tell you, though, it was an awkward fit last year. They didn't have another guy that could relieve some pressure off of him. They didn't have another guy who could create offensively, and that put a lot of pressure on guys like Ochai Agbaji and Christian Brown to maybe step outside their comfort zones, which they weren't really comfortable with. And so I think with the additions to the roster this year, potentially things will go a lot smoother on the offensive end, and they have guys who not only can create for themselves, but can make it easier on other teammates, and that's something that Marcus Garrett really struggled with last year, maybe trying to do or having to try to do too much when that really wasn't his role.
Yeah, you talked about the metrics. Ranked 207th in the country per KenPom in 2-point field goal percentage. That's an anomaly for them. Only 48.9%, 33% from 3-point range. So they were not super efficient from 2-point range, and they were not great from 3-point range, which is rare. However, Jesse, we turn the page here to the new players coming in. Let's start with the transfers. They have the number one recruiting class for freshmen coming in as per 24/7 Sports. But I want to start with the transfers. They have certainly reloaded, and they have 4 new guys coming in.
Yeah, let's be blunt here. And I've kind of talked about this a little bit in the offseason. KU has the number one recruiting class, as you said, freshmen coming in, and from 24/7 Sports Composite. And there's a potential that none of them play.
I know. It's crazy. Yeah.
That's how deep Kansas is. I mean, there's the potential that those guys do not play anything but spot minutes. And that's because of the reloading of the roster. It reminds me a little bit of back. If you go back a couple years ago, KU got blown out by Auburn back in 2018, 2019, the NCAA tournament. Very similar. They were the better seeded team. They faced Auburn. Auburn just lit the nets up from 3-point range. KU was embarrassed. Bill Self in the postgame press conference basically promised that he would go out and have a better roster the next year. And it was sort of interesting because it kind of came about a different way then for him, is that most of what the positives were in the offseason then was he got Udoka Azubuike and Devon Dotson to decide to stay at Kansas rather than going pro. But if you remember, that was the COVID-shortened year that there was no NCAA tournament, but Kansas was going to be the number 1 overall seed heading into that tournament. And
Jesse, they were awesome. They were totally awesome. They had it all. I completely agree with you. Great memory.
Yeah, and so, I mean, that kind of is what happened again here, is that KU goes in, better seeded team, goes not with huge expectations, but, figuring it could make a Sweet 16, gets blown out by USC. It looks like a big talent disparity. And so Bill Self goes out and basically remakes his roster. I mean, it's completely crazy. But Remy Martin is the guy that, we'll all talk about here. 2-time all Pac-12 player, point guard for Arizona State. But all those things I just mentioned with Marcus Garrett, those are the things that Remy Martin is. He can hit an outside shot. He can create for himself and for others. He's been asked to do a lot of different roles at Arizona State, but that's the prototypical point guard we just talked about. The Tyshawn Taylor, the Sharon Collins, the Devontae Graham, the Frank Mason, that sort of player who can average 17, 18, 19 points a game, be the leader offensively. And when things get tough, Bill Self just calls a high ball screen. And when you call a high ball screen with a guy like Remy Martin, he can go out and get you 2 points. And like I said, potentially can go out there and now help guys like Ochai Agbaji, who he's a talented spot-up shooter on the outside, and he's not great at going off the bounce himself. But, you're going to have to play off a little bit to give something up when Remy Martin is driving. And maybe if guys help too much, Ochai Agbaji is hitting threes or Christian Brown's hitting threes. So all of a sudden, all these pieces maybe start to fit in a little bit better. Other guys he added, Jalen Coleman-Lands, a talented outside shooter from Iowa State. So we'll see where he gets in the rotation. And then Joseph Yesufu, a guy who really lit it up in the NCAA tournament late when Drake had some injury issues down the stretch. He's kind of known for that viral dunk he had against Wichita State in the first 4, where he went up over the top of a guy. And I'm telling you, I think he's listed at 6 foot. If he's 6 foot, I might be 6'3". I think he's more eye to eye with me at 5'9". But again, has some explosiveness and obviously can hit some threes too, based off the numbers he's had. So Bill Self brought in all these pieces. Like I said, if you did not play a part in the rotation last year, you're probably not on Kansas's roster this year. And so you add that to all the other guys he brought in. Cam Martin, a Division II All-American for a couple years, a stretch 5 sort of player that Bill Self really hasn't had in the past. So a lot of options for Bill Self, and that's not even touching on the recruiting class, which we just talked about. Those guys could play a role as well if they need him. The question is whether they'll need him or not.
The Sharon Collins comparison with Remy Martin is spectacular. They run the show. They're going to play hard on defense, and they can make a big shot when you need it. That is a tremendously deep group of transfers coming in. Joseph Yesufu was outstanding for Drake. I mean, injuries happen, and Drake could have went even further if they were healthy, but he stepped in and played very, very well. Now, the key is going to be for many coaches. I've talked to John Becker at Vermont. I talked to Kermit Davis at Mississippi. They are having to blend transfers with the freshmen, and no one is going to have a harder job of that than Bill Self, because I'm looking here. You have 4 freshmen coming in here, Jesse, all 4-star recruits, all top 5 players in their particular states, Kansas, Texas, North Carolina, and here in New Jersey, of course. So talk about the freshmen. They're talented, but they're going to have to really be efficient in the minutes that they get.
Yeah, and I see this as a great experiment across college basketball, because if you are Kansas or you are Kentucky or you are one of those schools, you saw this from the last offseason. You can go out and poach a bunch of these transfers with the new rule. You know what I mean? And you can reshape your roster immediately if you want to. And so this will be fascinating, because Bill Self has had players in the past where it's taken some time for them to get going. It's taken some time for them to learn the offense or what he likes or the system. I'm thinking of a guy like Kelly Oubre, who came in, started immediately, but sort of struggled for a while. And then after that, went to a bench role for a while. And then by the end of the season, really had picked it up, started to show flashes, and then he was a one-and-done player. Sometimes it doesn't click immediately, but again, for the Bill Selfs and John Calipari's of the world, if you want to, I saw Fran Fraschilla talk to a high major coach, and he likened it to these top-level schools can either build through the draft, or they can build through free agency. And free agency sounds a lot better if it works, because then you got a guy that you've seen stats before. You're not guessing on them. You're not unsure of what they can do at the major Power 5 level. Kansas can go take Drake's best player. They can go take Arizona State's best player. So we'll see how this all works, because if it does work, I think you could see this a lot more from these higher schools. Is just if these guys don't work out, then you move them on to somewhere else and you shuffle in new transfers. But yeah, the freshmen for Kansas, who knows what role they're going to play. A guy like Zach Clements, who is, as I mentioned before, with Cam Martin, he's kind of like Cam Martin, only he's a freshman. He's shown some ability to play on the perimeter. He can shoot threes. He's got good size at 6'9", 6'10", a well-respected recruit. But again, KU went out and got Cam Martin. So what role is he going to play in there? That's a good question when it comes down to that. You got a guy like KJ Adams, who well-respected, a guy that, a lot of people were in on and very athletic. But again, what role will he play on Kansas? I don't know. It's to be determined. The reality is, grabbing all this talent and bringing it in sounds great in theory, and fans love it in the offseason, coaches love it in the offseason, but there's only 5 guys who can play, and there's only one basketball. And is Remy Martin not going to get 33, 34 minutes? Is Ochai Abashi not going to get 33, 34 minutes? You start losing the ability to put subs in very quickly, unless Kansas has 2 or 3 injuries or has early transfers or something like that. So when it comes to this freshman class, I think it's an uphill battle. They're going to really have to show something early and show that they can not mess up and make other players better to get in the rotation, because otherwise, guys like that, I just mentioned Adams, Clements, Bobby Pettiford they got late, who was formerly a Louisville commitment. Those guys are really, I think, going to struggle to get in the rotation early. And, if it doesn't happen early for Bill Self, a lot of times in the year, he doesn't have trust in you, and then you don't play much late. So it'll be tricky. It'll be definitely competitive. But as of right now, all those guys are expecting to come in and fight for the minutes that they're going to get. And so we'll see how it all shakes out.
And Jesse, you haven't heard anything about them possibly transferring or any interest, because with some of these guys being signed, I'm curious. You said Pettiford came over, was going to go to Louisville, came over. Just wondering, because if these guys all stay and they buy in, almost like a Calipari with Kentucky, where they're buying in, they play limited minutes, they could come back and be dominant next year because of the experience. But I would think a lot of these players, when they're high-star recruits, they want to come in and see playing time. So you haven't heard any waves from guys possibly going out because of the transfers coming in?
Not yet. No, and obviously they'll want to go and everybody's confident. You should be confident in your own abilities, or otherwise you wouldn't end up at a school like Kansas. I think you have to be sure to view this from both ways, though, too, because that really is, I think, the new way of college athletics, what it's going to be, which is if you don't play right away, there could be interest on your part to use your one-time transfer to leave, to go to a school that you can. And the opposite could be true. If you don't show something in your first year, there could be some motivation from coaches to say, things aren't going to work out here for you. Maybe you aren't the player that I thought you were. Maybe it's best for you to move on, and best for both parties to move on. And like I said, not to be totally unemotional about these things, but this offseason with Kansas, the guys that weren't in the rotation last year, that were younger type players, a lot of them moved on. A lot of them are no longer with Kansas. Tristan Aruna is with Iowa State. Tyon Grant Foster, he moved on. They had a couple other guys. Jethro Muscadine, he's no longer with them. Latrell Giselle barely got off the bench. He moved on. So it's tricky right now, and it's a new world, and we don't know how it's all going to shake out. But I agree with you. In theory, those guys, if they stayed at Kansas and remained patient, and the coaches remain patient with them, yeah, you could have a nice foundation of building for the future and believing that there could be some special things in a couple of years. However, having said that, you also could come to the conclusion, based off of last year, that if those guys don't contribute in this first year, maybe both parties will not be interested in the second year. So it is sort of a different feeling now with that immediate eligibility rule, just because you're not sure where both parties are coming from in this exact world of college basketball. So like I said, this is a big experiment, I think. If this works for Kansas and Kentucky and whoever else, that they can bring in, 5, 6, 7 transfers and have them be eligible immediately and be upperclassmen, and everything works out, then you're probably going to see them do that more in the future. But KU has that security blanket where if it doesn't work out, they still have a very good freshman class. If they want to build that way, they can do that as well.
Kansas always at the top of the Big 12. We know that. And last year, right behind Baylor, had a fantastic year, national champions, but Kansas was right there. Let's look at non-conference schedule, which is always, Jesse, a great part of the Kansas resume in March. Every time I look at the net and I try to see as we come down and I do the bracket preview and try to project it, I say, man, look at that non-conference schedule for Kansas. Look at the teams they played. And last year, no exception. Gonzaga, Kentucky, Creighton. I mean, just battling top teams there, not afraid of it. Who do they have on the slate this year so far for non-conference? I know it's not complete yet, but they probably have some games out.
Yeah, absolutely. And Bill Self, this is what he does. He tests his guys, and he's not afraid to play teams. And you mentioned a lot of it for postseason. I think the NCAA has smoothed some of that out with the new net rankings. KU used to really abuse the RPI because they would always take on the best teams in the worst conferences. And that way, half of the RPI that you had was your opponent's overall record. So if you played a Vermont, let's say, and they would end up the season 20-6, and you would beat them by 20 at Allen Fieldhouse, that would really help your RPI. And KU sort of inflated itself by then. But they've got trips everywhere, man. Like they have 2 different trips to New York, one including the Champions Classic this year.
Yes, Champions Classic. Yes. Yep.
Yeah. And so they also play at St. John's. I think it's in the new hockey arena that they're building out there. They play at Colorado, which is a tricky game, not only because Tad Boyle has that program going, but also because of the elevation. KU will have a bunch of fans out there. You know, Western Kansas will drive, but over time, that's been one of the best home court advantages, just because I think you get midway through the second half, and as much as your coach yells at you to not care about the elevation, your body's feeling a little bit different than the Buffalo's bodies are feeling, just because they're so used to it. So,
Jesse, I do some writing for Action Network, and we are constantly taking into account when the Pac-12 teams are going Utah, Colorado back to back. I can just tell you that from a wagering perspective, that second game is really difficult. Yep.
I'm telling you, like people don't want to hear me on that thing, but that's a real thing. If you look at the numbers and the home court advantage, the elevation is one of the top things you have out there. And like I said, KU will have a lot of fans there, but the reality is, if you can't breathe, that's going to be a little bit different for you when you go there. They're reviving the series with Missouri, so there's going to be a game at Allen Fieldhouse with that. They also, what will be very intriguing is at the beginning of the new year, they have the Big 12 SEC Challenge, which comes in the middle of conference season, or toward the beginning of the middle of conference season. KU gets Kentucky, and at that point, it could be very, very close in the all-time wins race, and it would be very, very, very fascinating if that happened to be a moment when those two schools were either within one of each other or tied.
Great point. That's great point. Yes,
because that sort of thing with the fan base definitely plays up for both of these fan bases. Kentucky does not want to surrender that number, and KU fans definitely want to take over that number. And then you add to it the Orlando. They're going to Disney World for the 3-game trip over Thanksgiving. Potentially could play in the finals against Alabama. So. Bill Self, again, maybe almost to his detriment, sometimes it feels like they can't play a lot of their bench guys and develop depth because they have to win every single one of these games, and they play so many tough ones. But this year's no different. I just mentioned all of them. I mean, that schedule is loaded just like other schedules are, and so Bill Self is ready to take on that. And then, we could talk about conference. This Big 12 conference is going to be pretty darn top-heavy this year. Yep. I mean, loaded. Texas, really good. Yep. Baylor, going to take a step back with some of their guards, but they have talent coming in behind them, and guys like Matthew Meyer who should step into bigger roles and do it immediately. So Texas Tech's a wild card, but this should be a tough Big 12, and Bill Self's not taking it easy on his guys when it comes to the non-con either.
Yeah, Chris Beard now over at Texas, recruiting very well, getting players to come in. That Texas-Kansas game going to be great, as it always is. Jesse, thank you so much. Just one more question, I'll get you out of here. Amazing work here for Kansas, one of the top teams in the country. So what do you think? I mean, obviously it's Final Four or bust. That's the way it is every year for Kansas. But with the depth and the recruits and the transfers, if anyone can handle it, it's going to be Bill Self. How do you think it's going to go this year for the Jayhawks?
Yeah, again, stop me if you heard this before, but I think Kansas is a favorite in the Big 12. They've won so many of them, and that's sort of where Bill Self has always positioned his team. But the big question is just figuring out the right guys, figuring out the rotation, keeping guys happy. Bill Self has been a master at this in previous years, and I feel like I've said before, this has been the team he's had with the most depth. But, I was kind of playing with some of the numbers over at bartorvik.com, and I did adding and subtracting guys, and it's legitimate. Like this year, Bill Self probably has 2 top 25 rosters on his one roster. So I don't know what you do with that. I mean, I don't know if you go do crazy things like full court press or platoon or change your defense or whatever the case may be. But I'll be fascinated because this team, you don't really need 12 or 13 or 14 guys in college basketball, but I'm telling you, Bill Self has 13 or 14 guys he could play this year. So if any time they're going to do something crazy, it would be this year. But more than anything, you got to find 8 or 9 guys and have them like playing for each other and have them, commit to what the coach is talking about when it comes to, being unselfish for the team. So we'll see where KU lands with that. I think KU is sort of high floor, high ceiling, but I would be a little bit more worried about just figuring out how all those pieces fit together. Bill Self's done it in the past, but that's going to be the major challenge for this year as well.
And the Jayhawks are a machine. Of course, MJ Rice is already committed for the class of 2022. So, Jesse, we've started the preview for the following year as well. We can continue on here. Great work as always, folks. Jesse Newell, have to follow him on Twitter at Jesse Newell, Kansas City Star. Covers KU basketball, football as well. Amazing writer, does a great job. Jesse, thank you so much for a few minutes here, hopping on our train to talk about the Jayhawks, one of the top teams in the country, and they just keep reloading.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks so much.
I'm addicted to the appetite.